Inner Peace Press, bringing soul stories to life. Hello and welcome to Inner Peace Press's YouTube channel. I'm Heather Felty, publisher of Inner Peace Press, where we bring soul stories to life. I am very pleased to be joined today by Dr. Kramer in San Diego, California, who has just recently published Healthy Grief. Karen, welcome and thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Heather. It's a joy.
It's been really wonderful working with you in this topic of grief. I know it's a topic that a lot of people don't like to address, which is in part of the subtitle of the book, Normalizing and Navigating Loss. In a landscape of toxic positivity, I know that's not exactly correct, but this idea that we a lot of times shy away from grief, and so it's really important for us to express it and get the conversation going. And so for that, I'm very happy that you brought this book to Inner Peace Press so that we can get people talking about grief, because that is very healthy in our day to day. You've been working as a grief recovery expert for some years now. And I know that you, from the stories that I've heard, have been making an incredible impact individually with people with your NLP breakthrough sessions. So why write a book now?
It's a good question, Heather. So why write a book now? Well, I will tell you, I felt that there was a book inside of me. And yes, other people have also mentioned, hey, there's a book inside of you. That's a great story. You should tell it. And also, I had this experience where I'm like, oh, ick. I don't want to write a book. I don't want to be like everybody else. And when I really settled in, I had 3 clients with amazing experiences within a short period of time. I realized for myself this wasn't about me writing a book or not. It was more about getting this information out to other people. Other people need to know, one, the impact that grief has on the body, to understand grief itself, and also to understand how to release it for the body. So once I backed away and said, it's not about me, it's about other people, I knew I had to get this book out.
Mhm. So is that to say that the work that you're doing individually with people is like that work is also in the book? Are you sharing the practices that you do with people individually?
Yes, and so it is not completely in the book, because when doing the work with the clients that I have, obviously it is based upon their individual issues, topics, and grief that are coming up. However, what I wanted to do was provide an opportunity for other people to understand what is grief, that it truly is more than just death and dying, that understand that a minor or major aches and pains and ailments can also just be grief that's stuck in the body, and in a simple and easy way, be able to understand how to release it in a way in which it is something that is natural and normal for them. Hence the reason why I bring in various different stories as well, and provide an opportunity for them to take a book and learn more about themselves. Now, does this mean that that's the end all and be all, that they will read a book and be able to process through in a way in which I work with my clients? No. It will just raise the awareness, and it'll also give them opportunities about how to process it on their own. But it's not the place to take the place of a professional, such as working with an NLP practitioner, such as myself. But it's a great start, and it can also help them depending upon the type of grief they're managing, they're dealing with.
Nice. And that is a good point, that this book, it's not just talking about grief in terms of death. So would you just touch a little bit on the different types of grief that are discussed in the book?
Yes. So let's start with what grief is. So if you
Mm.
look up the basic definition of grief, as I did, and Google it, you're going to find something such as a deep emotional sorrow based on a significant loss, which I agree with. Where I added on to that is when what once was is no longer. When what once was is no longer. So since we're talking about a book, think about it almost like a book itself. where whether it's that person was alive, whether it's a job, a health, financial situation, whatever it was that once was something, and then something happened in your life and it no longer is that way. You have this experience as you start going into that next chapter of your life, that proverbial chapter of your life, when it is different. You don't have what you previously had, and which gets into the disenfranchised grief, which basically is a type of grief that is not necessarily valued or significantly seen in our culture as a grief. However, and especially with the clients I work with, they experience some of the same grief type symptoms and behaviors and emotions as somebody who's dealing with somebody who's going through death and dying. Like, for example, going through a divorce, as an example. So, if I'm going through a divorce, I'm losing a sense of, not only am I losing a partner, but I'm losing a sense of who am I when I'm no longer a wife? If, which actually did happen to me in my situation, if I'm dealing with a blended family, am I still the stepmom of my stepkids? And how am I going to manage the finances? So, all those dynamics are things that are part of disenfranchised grief. And in other words, it's not the standard grief, but having similar symptom to it. Now, one that I know you know, Heather, as well as many of us who are listening, is a thing called COVID grief. The idea that we experienced on a global level, experienced something that affected us back in 2020 and for many years afterwards. This thing where we weren't quite sure. We had lost our sense of normalcy. We had lost our sense of being able to socialize the way in which we wanted to, safety, security, even in some cases, trust in authority figures that we normally would trust, whether they're political, whether they're medical, whether they're therapy. We started to question some of those because so many things were changing. So when it comes to grief, it is more than death and dying. It's the loss that we find in everyday life when what once was is no longer.
Right. So intimate relationships, other relationships, health, identity, and the trilogy that you share at the end, where three things come together as well,
Yeah.
three different grief type experiences. So this is a question on my mind in thinking about what once was is no longer, is it how long does grief go on? And doesn't, I mean, the whole the only thing we can count on is change, right? The only constant is change. So how does grief change over time, and does it ever get resolved?
Yes. So, first of all, what you were describing are the 7 different chapters that I have in the Healthy Grief, okay, which talk about the various different types of grief, from death and dying, relationships, career, health, etc., and those who have the 3. So, thinking about how, and what's coming to my mind is, how do I know when I have processed through grief? And I think that's a question to answer, especially when it can take people various different amounts of time to be able to process through grief, because it is so individually. So, for example, if I had a beloved cat that passed away, and it's taken me months and months and months to be able to process through because I'm so attached to that beloved cat, versus somebody who may have a parent who passed away. So, think similar, right? Similar as a passing of a loved one, but more easily process through the passing of that parent. It doesn't mean that they don't love that parent less than somebody else like me did my cat. It's all a matter of what's underneath that. What are some of the things that are leading to the way in which we act and react to grief? And that's part of what this book is about, because it's really on the surface level, we're talking about grief, but really it gets to what are those traumas, triggers, and limiting beliefs? What are those things that are underneath that cause me to react to that loss and then experience this grief? So it whether it is the passing of a pet, or passing of a parent, or like we say, health issues, identity issues, whether it's relationship issues, whatever those are, you can't really compare them. Why I may experience something more or less than somebody else comparatively, because I'm going through my own grief process based on my own past triggers, traumas, and limiting beliefs. So identifying what those are then helps me better able to process through that grief. So having said that, one question I then phrase is, how do you know when you have healthfully processed through grief? And some ways to know is when you're faced with something that might trigger you. So for example, if it is, let's just keep it simple here. So if it is the passing of a loved one, and if it is a holiday, for example, and that person's not there, like pulling out a holiday stocking with their name on it, or you see an old Facebook memory pop up, or somebody asks you about that person. And again, something that may trigger that grief is what I'm referring to. So when you find yourself in those situations where either that might trigger you, okay, then you know you are more healthfully processing through grief when either you can talk about it or have that experience without having such a deep emotion about it, or you can have some emotion about it, which may last for 10 seconds, it may last for 10 minutes, or even the day, but it's not something that is pulling you down and taking you down for days and weeks and months at a time, which some of my clients like to call the spiral. Something happens, you pull out that stocking for the Christmas holiday, it has their name on it. All of a sudden, months later, you're still spiraling down in that emotion. So healthfully grief is that you can still have those emotions, such as missing a loved one who has passed, because pretty much missing is also part of love, and also not letting it spiral down.
No, I love that. Thank you. It just makes me think so much about how emotions play such a big role. And I like that how you say about the traumas and the triggers, because it's not necessarily that this person passed or that you lost this thing you had. It's what is underneath it all. And so that is definitely helpful for the readers of Healthy Grief to be able to look at that on themselves and see how they can grow. In their own life and their own grief experience.
Yes. And I think that's also, to Heather, to that point, a reason why the 5-stage healthy grief framework is so important, because it really does tap into, what are you thinking? What are you feeling? What actions are you taking? What support do you need? And what is that future? And what does it look like? Even if it's, what does it look like in this moment? And that's the basis of the Healthy Grief book, is having that way to ask those questions on a daily basis to be able to process through, and kind of putting an X on the map to say, here's where I am right now in my emotions. Here's where I am right now in my thinking. Here's where I am right now in where I am focusing on the future. Even if it is today, the future is where I want to be at the end of the day or at the end of the week, versus I can't think a month or 3 months out because I don't know right now. That's okay. Just keep on asking yourself those questions and going through the process like we have laid out in Healthy Grief to help you move one step forward.
I just love that. And that then also answers the question before about how long does grief last, or the exact words, but that, it can continue, but it hits you in different ways over time.
It does. It does. And it is recognizing that grief is different for everybody. The process that you're going through is unique for everybody. And that's another benefit of the Healthy Grief framework, because all it does is it provides that guideline of questions to be able to keep on moving you down that path without saying you have to do this. You have to go down that path. And that's the beauty of having the 30 grief survivor case studies in there as well, because people are going to gravitate to different stories, gravitate to different types of grief that these people went through, since there are 7 different categories, or maybe gravitate to the ways in which they took action here, support here, or what they thought or felt here. So that's another beauty of having those stories in there and the case studies, because it allows the reader to understand how the five stage healthy grief framework is placed upon each of the stories to give the reader hope and inspiration and ideas.
Mhm. Absolutely. I think you probably already answered my next question, but I'll say it anyway. I know that there's more to it. So when we first started talking about this book, and you said you wanted to write something about grief, but you didn't want to write only your stories. And so there comes the 30 different stories using clients, past friends, people who you know, um, different grief survivors sharing their stories. Can you speak a little bit to the vulnerability of sharing your own stories in the book,
Mm.
and that what can you tell others about the importance of sharing your experience?
Yes. So talking both about my vulnerability and sharing a story, as well as those that are in the book, and encouraging you, those of you who are watching it, to also share your own story. Well, I'm going to start back from a logistical perspective. And Heather, I think it took me about at least a month and a half, if not two, to actually start putting pen to paper or fingertips to the keypad to start writing, because I had these ideas in my head, but I really wasn't quite sure exactly what I wanted to write about. I had a concept. I knew it was around my client experiences, but I truly hadn't formulated it. So you, Heather, challenged me to at least put out so many words. So I sat down and I said, okay, I'm going to start with my stories, because at least that's what I do know. And let's see what happens. So I ended up in that 1 week writing 5 different stories, writing about my divorce, writing about my father's passing, all of these different things, and just writing it out. And it started to flow. That was the big thing. It started to just flow as I started to write. And as I stepped back and looked at everything, I think I probably, I don't know how many X, the tripled the number of, or quadrupled the number of word count that you had, because I wasn't focusing on the word count at that point in time. I was just getting in the flow of writing. So say to anybody watching here is, if you're stuck trying to go, just write. And maybe it is something just to write about, a story or about yourself, to just write. For me, it was very cathartic. I admit it really helped me. And it got, in the process of writing, I got to see the parts that maybe I was emotionally still raw. I got to see the parts where I'm like, wow, Karen, that's amazing. You actually wrote about that, where had it been a year ago, you would have been in tears or angry about it. And so it was very helpful for me to just write it, and the process of emotionally checking in with each part of the process. Then when I stepped back and I said to you, Heather, I said, I don't want this book to be about me. It's not about, I'm not the type of person that's like, here's my story, all about me. That's just not who I am. And so I got to step back and say, okay, what is the message of the 5 stories that I had at that point in time? What do I want readers to take away from this? And that's when I'm laughing now because I remember I was a shower moment. I got in the shower saying, I want some easy framework for people to know
Mm.
what to do and how do I process through with my clients in such a way that I could stick it in the book. And I walked in the shower and I'm like, grief, it's grief, it's GRIEF. So I walked out of that shower and so excited sharing with you, Heather. I'm like, I got it, I got it. And it's just something where the healthy grief framework came from that process, because I wanted other people to walk away with something that was easy, it was memorable, and they didn't have to grab the book each time to try to remember it. Now, to answer the second part of that question, Heather, around other people sharing their stories, it started also with the other people that I brought in and invited to be part of this book. I started with my clients. Again, one of them was one of the ones that was an inspiration for this book. So I started with her. Then I started going to current and past clients to see if they wanted to be a part of this book. I even posted something on Facebook that said something like, hey, when you think about grief, what are some situations? Comment below. And my intention in posting that was to actually see what other people thought of when I mentioned the word grief beyond death and dying. And sure enough, other people also responded in with things like natural disasters and divorces and other things. Then I thought, hey, what about some of these people that I either, on Facebook, how many people we have, some I didn't really connect with, or like one of the stories that's in Healthy Grief was a sorority sister of mine from 3 decades ago. So once I put it out there, people were responding, and I realized there were some really good, rich stories that are there, some grief stories that were there. So that started the ball rolling for me inviting other people. So then I got on the phone with some of these individuals, and in essence, I was interviewing them. So being a grief recovery expert, I never want to re-traumatize somebody.
Mm.
Even in the work I do around grief, I am very careful in the work that I do that I'm not re-traumatizing somebody in the process of their healing. And there's many techniques to allow them to healthfully do that. So I reached out to some of these individuals, and my intention was to hear their story and also get a sense as to whether they were enough through their grief process, that they were helpfully enough through their process that they would be open to writing about it. And I remember asking, having a conversation with one gentleman who unfortunately lost his son to suicide 11 years prior to me having a conversation with him. And it was questionable, and he had trouble writing it. So I graciously asked him, I said, it's not the right time. This was not the intention of him being part of this book and re-traumatizing it by telling his story. So the storytellers, they grace me with their time. I handpicked them. This is not a co-authored book. They didn't pay to be in it. They didn't bribe me. That was none of this. This was me specifically reaching out to specific individuals in these different categories. So I had a breadth of experiences. I had a breadth of gender, ethnicity, types of grief, etc. I really wanted a wide range of individuals so that you as the reader can really tap into the ones that resonate the most with you. And I know that's a long way of explaining it, Heather. The backside of that is for you as the reader to also encourage you to write your own story. And even though I don't actually put that in there about writing your own story, it's like recognizing, even if it is telling your story, the subtext to the subtitle to this book is normalizing and navigating loss in a culture of toxic positivity. And the only way that we can truly normalize it is to have those conversations around grief. So they're not difficult. They're things that we talk about on a regular basis without shying away or trying to downplay certain things. And the more we can normalize them and talk about them, then they're not something that when we're experiencing it, we're going to shy away or isolate ourselves or even think that we're the only ones. We're not, and we're not alone. And that's a big message in this book, especially with the 30 people who are part of the case studies that are in here, the 30 case studies. So I encourage you reading this or hearing this, if this is something that you're resonating with, write your story out, because you in there might actually have a book. I know thank you. That's how my book started with you, Heather. I appreciate that.
Thank you. And I'm glad that you brought up the subtitle of the book, Normalizing and Navigating Loss in a Culture of Toxic Positivity, just so I have it right there. So one of my questions for you is just to talk a little bit about what is toxic positivity, and what impact does it have on grief?
Yes, and I'm glad you asked, because usually when we finally narrow it down, I say, well, when we finally narrowed down the title and I started telling people about it, I was watching their mind. Okay, healthy grief. Okay, normalizing and navigating loss. Okay. And a culture of toxic positivity. And all of a sudden their eyes would get really big. And I'm like, okay, I'm on to something. So I like to describe toxic positivity for two parts. We have a griever and we have a supporter. And typically, toxic positivity is seen more as, let's say, the supporter for a griever. Like, hey, cheer up, or he's gone to a better place, or you have to be better for the kids. Some comments that, although they may be well intended to either cheer up the griever or provide some positive spin, what they're doing is they're downplaying the emotions that that griever is having. So the biggest thing for somebody who's going through grief to help them heal is to be seen, heard, and understood for their grief. So any well-meaning intentions that are coming towards their way about their grief that are not honoring, seeing, hearing, and feeling and knowing about their grief would hinder their own process. So then if I'm the griever and I have some kind of comment that's coming that way, I may not feel safe then to share my grief. I may feel I have to isolate or hide, that maybe I am alone, that I am that other people won't understand the grief I'm in. And even though that may sound logically silly, it is not, because that on an emotional level may be what some of the grievers are experiencing. So although I gave some cursory examples here in Healthy Grief, I get into talk more about what are some of the phrases that somebody, and again, it may be well intended, may say to a griever that actually may be harmful, and what could they say instead? Like for example, another one is a well-intended supporter may say something to the griever to cheer them up because they, the supporter, are feeling uncomfortable about somebody else not being happy around them. Mm-hmm. Then on the griever side of it is there's also toxic positivity that they may experience for themselves. I have to put on the smile and the happy face because I sure don't want somebody to ask me why I'm sad, because I don't want to break down crying in front of everybody, or I don't want to place my problems on everybody else. So I'm going to put on that fake smile and just be happy for others, or whatever it is. It's a way, as a griever, toxic positivity is putting on that smiley face to cover up what is underneath. And this, by the way, is different. And we have one story that is in Healthy Grief, Jerry Lynn by name, who she herself is a very positive person. And she's going through her own health journey. And so when I shared with her my definition of toxic positivity, she actually shared, hey, I am a positive person, and going through my health journey, it's important for me to be positive as well as going through there. So we had a very good conversation around what is natural, healthy positivity, which in this case, she is a natural, happy, healthy, positive person. And there's research out there, especially when it comes to going through grief and especially health issues, to be able to bring in the positive side. The difference between that natural, normal, healthy positivity and toxic positivity is when we feel that we are hiding or hindering our own health process because we feel we have to put on the happy face. So I want to clarify the difference between that. This is toxic positivity, is when that positivity is hindering the griever's ability to healthfully process. Okay.
And oh, please go ahead.
You mentioned something about culture too. So I wanted to tap into this, that in our culture, there's a culture about, we got to be happy, we got to be positive. Even in the United States, it's written into the Declaration of Independence about the pursuit of happiness. So there's a lot of pressure culturally that is placed upon us about being positive and happy. So when we do see somebody who is not happy, then there's that stigma of what's wrong with them. Why are they not happy? So if I'm the griever, I'm all of a sudden a problem. So part of this toxic positivity is allowing that person who's grieving to allow that space to process healthfully versus feeling they have to quickly move through that grief process to make everybody else happy, or that they're a problem because they're in a culture that's supposed to be happy.
Mhm. Absolutely, and that's one of the stories in the book, where the one mom, has a stillbirth, and then she
Yeah.
goes to the birthday party of her older child, and nobody in the room says a thing. And to me, that's so classic because of the definition of toxic positivity, because we're just avoiding it. And so we don't see that as necessarily toxic positivity, but that's what it is when we're just like in total denial and you're not there to support. The supporter isn't there to support the griever.
Yes, 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 that's Nicole's story. And when she first told me that, actually, she was doing an interview, or she was interviewing me at that point in time, and when she was sharing that story before she even submitted it for the book. And I asked her, I said, what would you have liked somebody to say or do? And she said, I would have liked somebody to at least acknowledge what had gone on, even to say, hey, I'm sorry. And that gets into that being seen, heard, and understood. All a griever wants is to be seen, heard, and understood to heal. And that goes for ourselves as well. When we're grieving, to be able to see ourselves, hear ourselves, feel and understand ourselves in the process, that is a big part of our own healing process, rather than feeling like we have to do something or hide ourselves from somebody else just to be accepted by the norm. So yes, and thank you, Heather. Yeah, Nicole's story is very powerful.
Because that, I mean, that stifles us as a griever, right? To not be like to, I have to worry about what somebody else is going to think about my experience. And so like, why even bother going out? Why be social? So this brings me back to how important this book is and how it's good that we can acknowledge the grief that we go through and also acknowledge the grief that other people go through. Because, if we can be there for each other, then hopefully we all collectively will have a better experience and we'll be able to not have these toxic situations, that we're trying to avoid essentially. So my last question for you today is that I've seen how helpful it is for me sharing my experience, my grief experiences with other people. What's sometimes, like we just said, we don't necessarily want to talk about it, or we don't, either it's too raw, either it's that we don't want to upset somebody else, or for whatever other reason. What's your advice to people to to people who have trouble expressing their grief experience?
Hmm, good. I'm To somebody who is having trouble expressing their grief experience, I will say this: grief is a natural, normal process of life. Think about it almost like the winter season. When we think about a tree and leaves, is that when it has those leaves, it can't just continue to hold on to those leaves for its lifetime, because the process of regrowth. So letting go of what no longer is supporting who it is at that point in time. So it has regrowth that grows back. So think about that metaphorically. And there's been a lot more resources, unfortunately, up to this time that focus specifically on how to gain, win, and acquire, and less so on how to lose, let go, and grieve. So knowing that it's a natural process, just like nature is with the leaves on a tree, is for us to understand that there will be losses in life. We will have losses in life, even if it comes to death and dying. Yes, hopefully this is not a surprise to anybody, but yes, we will lose individuals in our life. That is a natural, normal part of the process of life, just like relationships, just like old and new identities. Health will change throughout our life. So when we're more open to understanding that this is a natural, normal process of our life, then when these losses do happen, we're better equipped to engage in the conversations with other people rather than feeling isolated, lost, alone in that process, because you are not alone. And that is one of the main reasons why we put healthy grief out there, for you to know you are not alone. This is a lifelong companion. This book is not something to just quickly read, stick on the shelf, and collect dust. Use it as a lifelong companion, something that you can pull down off that shelf when you need it. Whether it is a friend or a family member that is going through some form of loss, whether it is a financial crisis, to a loss of a hamster, to death, to relationship, to health, whatever it is for you, you have this book to lean back on, to ask the simple questions, to be able to help that individual be able to process through, and to be more able to leave the leaves, let go of the leaves, to allow the new growth to come in. And for all of us, that new growth is so helpful and healthy for our body.
I love that metaphor. That's great. Thank you for sharing
Thank you.
that. I thought maybe I'll just show a little bit of the book quickly here. I'll just hold it up. So here we go. There's the book. And then just as an example, this section on relationships other just happens to be here. And then there's a little intro in each chapter, and then the story. So the story is here. And then at the end of the story, there is, whoa, the story in review. And then for each of the sections, we have these little icons to keep it standard throughout each story. And then for each, the grief model itself and the reflections. So that's the idea of the case study, is that there's a story and then this similar review at the end. Anything that you'd like to share about that?
Yes, yes. Two things. One is, I've had people say, I'm not really a reader. Do you have pictures in it? So, Heather, thank you, because you're the one who came up with the idea of the icons, so that it is easier for people to process through and look if they want to focus on body issues that are in there. When I say body, by the way, I'm talking about when grief settles in the body, or they want to focus on the emotion parts of it or the action steps part of it. You can easily skim through and look for that respective icon. And another thing, Heather, in there is the looking of, I've had individuals who've said to me, yeah, okay, I'm not really a reader. When is this book coming out on Audible? Well, the powerful thing is, for each of the 30 stories, there is the audio version of it as well. So what we shared with the storytellers, those grief survivors, is to read their stories as if you, the reader, was sitting on the other side of that Starbucks table or on the other end of that couch, and they're sharing their own stories from their heart. I know when I recorded my own stories, I know I broke down a little bit here and there. And I know other storytellers, those grief survivors, did that as well. So what you have in there is not only the stories, but you have that QR code, which will take you to the resource page. There's a number of other resources that are there, but truly the power comes in those 30 stories, to hear and listen to them while they tell their own story, whether you're reading along or not.
Love that. That's great. And that just makes me remember that a big part of this book is making sure, or helping people understand, that grief does settle in the body and that it can become disease at some point.
Yeah.
And so when we can understand that, number one, and then also healthfully process our grief, then we're more likely to not have that somatized within us. So maybe just a little bit on that as well.
Yes, yes. In fact, that takes me back to those 3 clients that I had right when I said, I need to write this book. It's time that this information needs to get out there to individuals. So I'm going to repeat, Heather, what you just said. Grief left unresolved will settle in the body. Grief will settle in the body. Now, does this mean if it's unresolved for a day, a week, or a month? No. What I'm saying is it will start to show up. It could show up 6 months from now. It could show up a year, 3, 5, 7 years. And there is research out there that actually does specifically around cancer, specifically, it can trace it back directly. And that's actually one of the client stories. She is in there, Stephanie's story about stage 2 colon cancer. And I knew exactly what was going on with her and went all the way back to what happened 5 years prior to that, where she was holding on to the guilt because she couldn't save her husband who had passed away 5 years prior to her getting that diagnosis. And once we released that energy, that trauma associated with it, it helped her body immediately start to heal. So that's the experience that I want people to understand, that unresolved grief will settle in the body and you can release it. But I want to get to people before it starts to somatize in the body. That psychosomatic, the mind body, it speaks. Our body speaks in so many different ways. So if you're experiencing minor aches and pains to major ailments, and heaven forbid, we never want to get to life-threatening diseases. And when I say that in diseases, dis-ease in the body. Diseases are all dis-ease in the body. So then we have to say, well, what's causing the dis-ease in the body? And in many cases, it's some past trauma, trigger, limiting belief, some form of grief that is settled within the body. So thank you, Heather, for reminding me to come back to that important point. Hence the title, Healthy Grief.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Karen, for sharing all these insights into your wonderful book, Healthy Grief, Normalizing and Navigating Loss in a Culture of Toxic Positivity. I do hope that you viewers will consider getting this book and using it to help you not only to release that dis-ease, but also to be a better supporter and to be a healthful griever. So with that, thank you for taking the time to talk with us today about this book, and excited to see where this book takes you in the future.
I'm excited as well.
Nice.
Thank you, Heather.
All right. Thank you. And for you viewers, thank you again for being here listening to the Inner Peace Press Author Network channel. And yes, again, please be sure to get your copy of Healthy Grief. Okay, like and subscribe so you can stay in touch. Bye-bye.
Bye.